Alright, welcome to the section HTML Basics, and in this section we will discuss HTML tags, which are the foundation for everything we'll do in this course. So, simply put, tags are a way to annotate text in HTML. So here we've got a sentence of text and another sentence of text, and let's say that the first sentence we would like to be a heading, a title, and the second sentence we would like to turn into a paragraph. It's very simple to do that in HTML. We simply start with opening tag, and each tag has less than and greater than signs, and in between is the actual specific tag. In this case it's H1, which stands for heading 1, heading level 1, and then we close it by specifying less than backslash H1 greater than. So this is an example of an H1 element in HTML. Again, to reiterate, this is the opening tag and this is the closing tag. So let's say that this second sentence we want to turn into a paragraph. We simply do this. We type less than P greater than, and P stands for paragraph, and we close it with less than backslash P greater than. So that's it, plain and simple. This is the opening tag and this is the closing tag. So that's the basic HTML tags for you. And now we'll discuss tag nesting. So you can nest tags inside other tags. The most important thing to remember is to close the nested tag before the closing of the parent tag. So this is known as an example of a child tag, and the P, the paragraph tag, in this case is the parent element or the parent tag. So the parent tag contains the child tag, and that's basically tag nesting. This is the P tag for paragraph and this is the M tag for emphasis. Okay, so the M tag is nested inside the P tag. It's also possible to have multiple levels of nesting, as this example shows. We've got 3 divs and each div is nested inside its parent div. So the first level div, the one that wraps the other 2 divs, is the topmost div, and then we've got the second level, which is the child of the first div and the parent of the third div, and finally the third level div is the child of the second level, and it's nested inside both of these divs, both of these elements. So that's multiple nesting, plain and simple. Next thing to discuss is HTML attributes and CSS targeting, because these two things are closely related and they're a simple but very important concept to grasp in order to work with HTML and CSS and Bootstrap, of course. So here we've got an example of an HTML snippet of code. We've got a parent div with the ID equals first, and this ID is the actual HTML attribute, and it's the attribute that belongs to this div element right here. And the first is the value that we give to this ID HTML attribute. The second level div also has an attribute, but this time it's the class attribute. And the third level div also has the class attribute, but this time is different. On the second level we've got the class of second, and on the third level we've got the class of third. Now the important thing to remember is that it doesn't really matter what you're going to name your IDs and class attributes. The names are really anything you come up with. So in this case the first corresponds to the text here, the second corresponds to the text here, and the third level corresponds to the text as well. But this doesn't have to be, there's no rule behind this. This is just something that I came up with on the fly. So that's it as far as the attributes go. And here we can notice one more time that this is the attribute for the first div, this here is the attribute and its value for the second div, and finally we've got the attribute and its value for the third div. Alright, moving along, we'll discuss CSS targeting, and in this example we'll show how to target elements themselves. So here we've got a snippet of HTML, and this is a div element, an HTML element called div, which stands for division, and it's a way to divide text on a page, to mark it up in some way. So CSS that will target this div element is plain and simple. First, we are using the div selector, and this selector and all the other selectors in CSS correspond to the tag element name. So if you are targeting a div, you simply type div. If you're targeting a paragraph, you type a P. So pretty much same as the HTML, except for the less than and greater than signs. We don't use that in CSS. So it's kind of like a stripped down version of the HTML tag. Then we provide squirrely brackets, opening and closing squirrely brackets, and inside we give it a property and a value to that property. So it's a combination of a property and a value. And if you think about it, this is kind of similar in CSS what we did right here. Here we've got the attribute and the value for the attribute in double quotes, and the equal sign in the HTML is similar to the colon here. Although these are two completely different things, the logic behind it is quite similar, and you'll even see that in JavaScript. So you've very often got the situation where you've got key value pairs. So here you could say that the attribute is the key and the first dash level is the value. Here color could be called the key and red could be called the value. But to be precise, in HTML, this that comes on the left hand side from the equal sign is called HTML attribute, and the thing in quotes is called the attribute's value. And here in CSS, we've got CSS property and CSS value. So that's an important thing to remember, because these terms are frequently used and it's good to be aware of what they stand for. Alright, so this div targets this whole HTML element. And if we had, let's say, 100 divs on a web page, all the 100 divs would be targeted with this one CSS declaration right here with the div selector, or also known as the element selector in CSS. However, there are also other ways to target elements in HTML pages using CSS, and the most common ones are IDs and classes. ID is an HTML attribute. We give it a value inside double quotes, and then in CSS to target this section right here, and then inside the CSS we give it the pound sign to signify the ID, and then the name of that ID from HTML. So in HTML it's ID equals double quotes 1, closing double quotes, and in CSS we've got pound 1. So this equals this. And then we provide inside squirrely brackets, we provide the property and the value. And in this case, the property is color and the value is green, which results in this text right here being colored green. And this word will be colored based on what we provide right here. To target an HTML class attribute, which we can see right here on this parents div, in CSS we simply type the dot, which signifies the class attribute, and then we provide the class name. In this case it was some-class. And then we open the squirrely brackets and we type the property, colon, and the value for the property. Property value, and we close it off with a semicolon. Okay, so this leads us to CSS specificity. So there is this thing called specificity, which basically gives a different weight, different strength to different CSS selectors. So depending on how you target your elements on your page, the engine of your browser is going to calculate which rule is going to be valid and which is not going to be considered. And to do that, CSS has a system of specificity, and here we've got an example of the most specific going to the least specific. So the most specific CSS selector is, in our examples, is the ID selector. And then we've got the class selector, and finally we've got the element selector. So this is the order. The ID selector is the most specific, and the element selector is the least specific. And of course the second most specific is the class selector. And if you think about it, this makes sense because the ID selector is considered proper use is one selector per HTML page. So you should not have two ID selectors of the same name inside your HTML in your web page, even though you might use, let's say, your ID selector on different elements. That doesn't matter. You should always have only one. And since you should always have only one, it makes sense that that one ID selector is the most specific. Whereas class selectors can be specified to as many elements as you like in your HTML pages. Okay, so we have a simple quick test for CSS specificity, so try to give the answer before you actually see it on the screen. We've got this HTML snippet right here, and we've got a class of some-class, and we've got the ID of 1 inside this parent div. So we've got a parent div, then we've got some text, and finally the last word inside this sentence here, or inside this fragment of text here, the last word is surrounded with its own HTML element. It's the span tag, and it's got the ID of 1. So now looking at this HTML snippet, we are going to provide some CSS for it. So we've got a div, so this is the element selector, and the property is given, property color is given the value of red. Then we've got the ID selector, and the color is blue. And finally we've got the class selector, and the color is orange. And now the question is, how is the page going to be rendered? What colors are going to be assigned to the word text and to the word sum?